Welcome to this first panel on the collapse of the liberal world order. My name is Prof. Troyer from Université Catholique de Louvain, and I will be the moderator of this morning. We have three panelists because, unfortunately, Professor Khan could not make it because of some health problems, but everything is okay. Every speaker will have about 30 minutes to present his view on the collapse of the liberal world order. Maybe there is a question mark on it. And we will start with Professor Prof, who is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. His publication, The Two Men at War, What Fiction Has to Tell Us About Conflict from Gilead to Catch-22, The Improbable War, China, US, and the Logic of Great Power War, Future War, and his most recent book is Rebooting Clausewitz on War in the 21st Century. He's a former twice-serving member of the Council of the Royal United Service Institute, a former NATO Fellow, and a regular lecturer at defense colleges in UK, US, Rome, Singapore, and Tokyo. Sir Prof, the floor is yours. You have first 30 minutes to
30 minutes?
Yeah, to present.
But that includes the Q&A?
No, you can do less and then we...
okay, fine. Okay. And you want me to be seated here or stand?
That's up to you. It's better, I think.
Look, if I'm going to talk for 20 minutes, I'll only be 20 minutes, I'll stand. It's easier. Okay. First of all, I'm sorry for the fact that my picture doesn't look very much like me. There's a great Oscar Wilde story, a portrait of what's his name? Dorian Gray. And he enters into a pact with the devil whereby he never actually ages, but the picture does. It's the reverse in my case. My picture never ages, but I do. I want to echo some of the things Jamie has said, and I will just talk for 20 minutes very quickly about the vacuum. A couple of books that came out recently. Richard Haas wrote a book called The World in Disarray. Robert Jarvis wrote a book called Chaos in the Liberal Order. Chester Crocker, former Reagan administration official, said that he's lived through times of disorder before, but they've never been so varied or so deep. So I think we can probably take as a point of departure the fact that the world is disordered, though I wouldn't use the term disarray necessarily. And of course, the first thing I think of as a political scientist whose first subject was history is, are there any historical analogies for that? Because the older order that we had addressed the reasons for disorder in the 30s. And the question is this order capable of addressing the disorders of the present day? And the answer, I think, is clearly probably not. But the point is, what are we going to get in its place? And how are we going to get there? So let me just go back to the 1930s. It's very easy to say that the historical analogy is there and that there are parallels. As Mark Twain said, history rhymes, it doesn't repeat itself. I think there are certain rhythms that we need to at least think about. The first is we have a bit of an economic vacuum. The Bretton Woods institutions that used to run the international economy with a fair degree of success are no longer the monopoly organizations. We have President Trump threatening to leave the WTO, but the WTO hasn't concluded a successful trade round since 1994. We have the G20 that was important in 2008 in saving us from another depression, but the G20 has disappeared off the map. We have countries that are even more indebted now than they were in 2008, Italy being an obvious case. And then we have trade tariffs, the United States back to what they were in 1950. Now, of course, the important thing is to understand that there are differences. We are much more interdependent than we were in the 1930s in terms of greater direct investment. The trade flows are greater than they were in the 1930s, and central banks now hold each other's government debts. But that's really the problem. The nuclear option if China began selling the American government debts. And we have now shaping up a trade war between the United States and China, and those are the two countries that are keeping the present show on the road. We mustn't also ignore massive Chinese indebtedness growing too quickly in the last 10 years, building all those airports that will never be used in cities that are actually uninhabited. So we have an economic vacuum. We have $267 trillion of debt. We have never been as indebted as we are now, and if we were to have a repeat of the 2008 crisis, we wouldn't have the same success in dealing with it because we've spent the money to a very large extent. So economic chaos, I think, is possibly around the corner. It's something that should at least engage our minds. The second is we have an ideological vacuum, because the old order that we lived through was a liberal order in so many respects, put together by the United States between 47 and 48. We now have an ideological vacuum. China and Russia are two countries that totally reject the liberal package that is in the order concerned. They both call themselves, they no longer call themselves nation states. This was an order that was meant to be based on the nation state. They call themselves civilization states. And civilization states have certain priorities that extend beyond those that nation states have given themselves. Thus, Medvedev often talks about a civilizational zone of interest on Russia's borders. Civilizational states do not allow Western ideas to penetrate. Xi Jinping's famous memo to the provincial governors in 2013, where he was talking about the infection of Western ideas. A patriarch of Moscow is saying that human rights, an invention of the West, an invention of Jews and Protestants, to be absolutely precise. The idea Jamie had touched upon is that these are countries that accept that there has to be a degree of a civil society interest, but the interest is very, very narrowly circumscribed. And their own NGOs, of course, the number of Chinese NGOs is growing all the time, are different from our NGOs. And even within the West, and this is the depressing fact, what Donald Tusk, I think, quite nicely called the political civilization that is the West, because we are a civilization as well with civilizational values. That is under challenge in Eastern Europe from Viktor Orban and others who now openly use terms that we would not have heard a few years ago. We are, so he said, a liberal democracy. We're not a liberal democracy, we're an illiberal democracy. We are anti-globalization. Most countries in the Western world are still in favor of globalization, and they recognize some of its dangers and some of the threats that it poses to its citizens. These terms are going to be very important, defining, world-defining, and EU-defining in this case. And the last point I would make in this respect is we're also seeing perhaps a challenge to universalism. And it's summed up particularly well, I think, by the fact that this is a year in which we've been remembering the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, the famous Prague Spring. You may remember Dubček's promise to the Czech people, socialism with a human face. Xi Jinping's promise to the Chinese people is socialism with Chinese characteristics. This, I think, is what I mean by civilizational challenges. And of course, Xi Jinping's idea of a new order is harmony with difference. But that basically means you respect us enough not to interfere or try to intervene in our affairs. No more discussions about Tibet, Xinjiang. What's happening there is extraordinary at the moment, but it's met with absolutely no condemnation from the Middle East whatsoever. Then we have a strategic vacuum. We have an administration in the United States that doesn't seem to like the world order that it puts together. And we've seen, of course, yesterday, with the nuclear treaty of Russia, blow to arms control. Jamie's quite right to say that there were problems with that treaty, and the Russians have been cheating with that treaty. But the question is, perhaps we should have stuck in there a little longer. We had another strategic vacuum in the exercises in the Russian Far East a few weeks ago, very small in terms of the Chinese contribution, about 7,000 men. But here we have now two organizations, NATO and the Shanghai Cooperation Council, that are possibly going to redefine the strategic map. We have a strategic vacuum in the Middle East, the end of the American unipolar moment, which came about in Henry Kissinger's Sinai disengagement talks, and then with the Camp David agreement, where for 30 years the United States was the only power outside the region that really mattered, and everybody recognized that fact. Now Russia is back. Now there are new alignments between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Now there, of course, are problems with Iran and what's called, rightly or wrongly, the Shia Crescent. We have new strategic realignments and alignments that are creating a strategic vacuum there as far as the rest of the world is concerned. And finally, we have the failure of the UN, which is very similar in many respects to the failure of the League of Nations in the 1930s. This is an organization that has been absent from most of the important conflicts. Absent in Syria, because of course Security Council deadlocked with the Russian veto. You can't really use the Security Council if its members don't want it to be used. But let's just remind ourselves, 700,000 people have died in Syria, and the United Nations has largely been absent from that conflict. Let's remind ourselves that 400,000 people have died in South Sudan, despite UN spaces. And let's remind ourselves that 7 million people have died in the Congo in the last 10 years. And again, the United Nations has been very largely absent from that conflict. This is an organization that had difficulty finding a new Secretary General some time ago. So wherever you look, you can see disarray, disorder. What do we do about it? I think it depends very much on the word that Jamie used, revisionism. Are Russia and China revisionist powers? Or are they powers that are seeking to renegotiate the international order to bring it in line with the realities of this century, on the understanding that probably its historical time may be over? Well, I think we have three scenarios if they are revisionist powers. One is that Russia, in particular, will continue to break international law and get away with it to a large extent, because sanctions won't stop it from breaking the game. The second is that China will simply bend the rules rather than break the rules, as it has quite successfully in the South China Sea, where the ability of the US Navy to do what it's supposed to do, freedom of navigation, is now very much in question. And then, of course, we have an organization that we tend to forget now, ISIS, because Raqqa fell. ISIS was an organization that wanted to throw away the rule book, neither to break the rules nor bend them, but just throw away the rule book. That organization is no longer of immediate interest to us, but there will be a successor. And that we know, and what form that successor takes would be interesting to see. I think there are some other alternatives which we might at least want to consider very, very briefly. One has probably gone, and that was the G2 world that Brzezinski, the late Brzezinski, was very keen on. This was a world in which China and the United States would retreat behind closed doors and decide the fate of the rest of us. You may remember that moment in the Copenhagen Environmental Summit some years ago where the EU was asked to leave the room while China and the United States did precisely that, talk about the future of the world. I think that moment has gone. The other possibility is two parallel systems which we're seeing emerge, an American-led system and a Chinese-led system. And I think the Great Belt and Road Initiative, which now involves 70 countries, is in itself very, very indicative of this. By the way, there's a civilizational facet of the Great Belt Road that people ignore, and that is UNESCO World Heritage Sites. After the Great Belt Road is finished, there will be 500 UNESCO World Heritage Sites in that area, which will top Italy, that has more UNESCO World Heritage Sites than any other country in the world. This is the kind of cultural battles, I think, that are going to be fought in the future. That parallel system is in the making. Whether it goes further, we'll have to see. Some of the members of it are beginning to suspect Chinese indebtedness as a real problem, and a number of countries have cancelled contracts already, Malaysia, of course, being one of them. The third is, I think, what Ian Bremmer calls a G0 world. That's a world in which there is no hegemonic power, there's no concert of powers as such, there's a global governance gap. Not a global government gap. This is a world in which deals can indeed be made by great powers and will be made by great powers to their own satisfaction. But governance, that is human rights and environment, civil society, and all the other things which we thought this multilateral scheme that Jamie talked about had put at the top of the agenda, that will largely disappear, wither on the vine. And that I think would be a great concern to all of us. So just to get back to the last point that Chester Crocker made about how disarrayed and disoriented the world is, the point he went on to make was that a world order is only as strong as the willingness of the great powers to actually keep it going on the road. And that's why a great British political scientist, Martin White, called great powers the great responsibles. Their responsibility is to keep the order going. And at the moment, what we see in the figure of Donald Trump, not necessarily everyone in his administration, and what we see in the figure of Vladimir Putin, who is his administration, not necessarily perhaps in the view of Xi Jinping, there is a reluctance to actually take responsibility for keeping the show on the road. And that, I think, is the challenge that we face most immediately. So that's my pitch, sales pitch. And if you'd like to, any Q&As in my time, that would be fine. We can go on to the next speaker.